In a quiet courtroom, a man stood with his head down. His clothes were worn, his face lined with struggle. He had been homeless for years, wandering the streets with nothing but the weight of his past mistakes. Today, he wasn't on the sidewalk begging for food. He was in front of a judge, waiting to hear his fate. His name was Daniel Carter. Once he had a normal life, a job, a family, a future. But one bad decision after another had taken everything from him. Addiction, loss, and desperation had led him to where he was now, alone, hungry, and facing charges for trespassing. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes, studied Daniel. His name was Judge Williams, known for being tough but fair. He had seen many cases like this. Most of the time, the stories were the same. People hit rock bottom, made bad choices, and never got back up. The prosecutor sighed. "Your Honor, this man has been arrested before. He won't change." Daniel swallowed hard. He had heard those words before. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was beyond saving. But then, the judge did something unexpected. Daniel stood still, waiting for the judge's decision. His hands trembled. He wasn't a violent criminal, but he had been arrested before. Loitering, petty theft, sleeping in places he wasn't supposed to. This time, it was trespassing. Judge Williams looked at the file in front of him. "Mr. Carter, you've been in and out of trouble for years. Why should I believe this time is different?" Daniel hesitated. What could he say? He had no excuse. No one ever gave him a real chance. "I don't know, Your Honor," he said softly. I don't want to live like this anymore." The prosecutor shook his head. "We've heard that before." Daniel felt the weight of every mistake he had ever made. He expected the worst: jail time, another night in a cell, another reminder that he was nothing. But Judge Williams didn't look angry. He looked thoughtful. "You lost your job 10 years ago," the judge said, reading from the file. "Your wife left, you struggled with addiction, and now you have nothing. No home, no money, no support." Daniel nodded. It was all true. The courtroom was silent. People watched, waiting for the judge to pass sentence. Judge Williams leaned forward. "Most people think jail is the only answer, but I don't believe that locking you up will fix anything." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "Your Honor?" Judge Williams ignored him. "Daniel, if I give you a second chance, will you take it?" Daniel's eyes widened. "A second chance? Yes. But not just a free pass. I have something in mind for you." Daniel's heart pounded. He had never been given a real opportunity before. He had nothing left to lose. "I'll take it," he said. Judge Williams nodded. "Then let's see what you do with it." The gavel came down. Daniel had no idea that this moment would change his life forever. Daniel walked out of the courtroom, still in shock. He had expected jail. Instead, Judge Williams had given him something else, an opportunity. But it wasn't just freedom. The judge had arranged for him to enter a work program, a local shelter partnered with businesses willing to hire people who were trying to turn their lives around. It wasn't charity. It was a test. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the shelter. Nervous. He was given a job at a small construction company. It was hard labor, lifting, carrying, working under the sun for hours. His body ached, but he refused to quit. The first few days were the hardest. He wasn't used to rules or schedules. Waking up early, showing up on time, staying sober, it all felt impossible. His coworkers didn't trust him at first. Some knew about his past. They whispered behind his back. "He won't last a week," one of them said. Daniel heard them, but he stayed quiet. He couldn't blame them. Even he wasn't sure if he could make it. But every time he wanted to give up, he remembered the judge's words, "Let's see what you do with it." So he pushed through. One night, after a long shift, he sat on his cot at the shelter, exhausted. An older man named Joe, another worker at the job site, sat next to him. "You did good today," Joe said. Daniel shrugged. "I barely kept up." Joe chuckled. "That's how it starts. You show up, you do the work, and one day, you realize you're not the same man anymore." Daniel thought about that. Could he really change? Over the next few weeks, something strange happened. His body got stronger. The work became easier. He started waking up on time, feeling a sense of purpose. The same coworkers who doubted him began to nod at him in approval. They saw him sweating in the sun, refusing to complain. He wasn't just another homeless guy anymore. He was one of them. Then came the biggest test. One afternoon, he walked past an alley and saw a group of men he used to know. They called him over, offering him a drink, a way to forget the pain for a while. For a moment he hesitated. It would be so easy to fall back. But then he thought about Judge Williams, about Joe, about the job he was starting to love. He shook his head. Not this time. He walked away. That was the moment Daniel realized he wasn't just trying to survive anymore, he was fighting for a new life. Change wasn't easy. Every morning, Daniel woke up before the sun, pulled on his work clothes, and went to the job site. The work was tough, but it wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was fighting the voices in his head. You'll fail again. You don't belong here. You're just a homeless man pretending to be someone else. Some days, he believed those voices. He felt like an outsider. He saw other workers laughing, talking about their families, their lives. He had no one. One afternoon his boss called him over. You've been doing good, the man said, but you're still holding back. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? You work hard, but you don't trust yourself. The boss sighed. I've seen guys like you before. They get close to a new life, then they run. Are you gonna run, Daniel? Daniel didn't answer. That night, he sat alone at the shelter, staring at the ceiling. He thought about running. He had done it before. When things got hard, he disappeared. But this time, he didn't want to run. The next morning, he showed up earlier than anyone else. He picked up his tools and got to work before his shift even started. Slowly, things began to change. One day, Joe, the older worker, threw an arm around Daniel's shoulder. You're one of us now, he said. The words hit Daniel hard. No one had ever said that to him before. But just as things were getting better, life tested him again. One evening after work, Daniel got a call from an old friend, someone from his past life. Come meet me, the man said. I know you got a little money now. Let's have some fun. It was tempting. For years, fun had meant drinking, drugs, and forgetting. But Daniel thought about everything he had built. He had a job. He had people who believed in him. He had a second chance. And for the first time in his life, he didn't want to throw it away. I can't, he said. The man laughed. You think you're better than us now? Daniel shook his head. No, but I want to be better than I was. That night, he sat alone, thinking about how far he had come. For the first time, he felt something new. Hope. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Daniel kept working, kept pushing himself. The job that once felt impossible was now part of his routine. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was improving. One day, his boss called him into the office. You've been here for 6 months, the man said. You've never missed a day. You work harder than anyone else. I think it's time we make this official. Daniel's heart pounded. You're giving me a real job? The boss chuckled. You've had a real job, Daniel. But now, you're getting a raise, benefits, and if you want, I'll help you find a place to stay. A real job. A real chance at life. Thank you, Daniel said, his voice shaking. That night he packed his things and moved into a small apartment, his first home in years. It wasn't much, but it was his. As he stood in the empty room, he thought about the judge, about that day in court when he had nothing. Now, he had a future. But the biggest change wasn't his job or his home. It was him. One day after work, Daniel saw a man sitting outside the shelter where he used to stay. The man looked lost, broken. Daniel recognized that look. He had worn it himself. He walked over and sat down beside him. Rough day? The man scoffed. Rough life, Daniel nodded. Yeah, I know what that's like. The man looked at him. You don't understand, I lost everything. Daniel smiled. So did I. The man frowned. Then how'd you get here? Daniel took a deep breath. Someone gave me a second chance. The man shook his head. No one gives guys like us a second chance. Daniel smiled again. That's what I thought too. And for the first time he realized something. It wasn't just about his second chance. It was about helping others find theirs. Daniel's life had changed, but he knew he wasn't the only one who needed a second chance. He couldn't forget the faces he had seen in shelters, on the streets, people just like him, waiting for someone to believe in them. So, he decided to do something about it. He started small. On weekends he visited the shelter where he once slept. He talked to the men there, listened to their stories. Some were like him, lost, hopeless. Others had already given up. You don't get it, one man told him. Once you fall, there's no getting back up. Daniel smiled. That's what I thought too. At first, people didn't believe in him. They thought he was just another guy who got lucky. But he kept showing up. He helped people fill out job applications. He connected them with work programs, just like the one that changed his life. Word spread. More people started reaching out. Then, one day, a local news station heard about what he was doing. They interviewed him, sharing his story with the world. A week later, his phone rang. "This is Judge Williams," the voice said. Daniel froze. He hadn't spoken to the judge since that day in court. "I saw your story," the judge continued. "I never expected my decision to have this kind of impact." Daniel swallowed hard. "Neither did I." Judge Williams chuckled. "You proved a lot of people wrong, Daniel, including yourself." Daniel smiled. He had come full circle. But he wasn't done yet. This wasn't just about his journey anymore. It was about changing as many lives as he could. A year passed, then another. Daniel was no longer the man who had once stood in a courtroom, ashamed and hopeless. He had built something bigger than himself. With the help of local businesses and shelters, he started a program to help homeless people find jobs, just like Judge Williams had done for him. One afternoon, Daniel was invited to speak at an event about second chances. As he stood on stage, looking at the crowd, he spotted a familiar face, Judge Williams. For a moment, Daniel's voice caught in his throat. He had spent years proving himself, but standing here now, he realized something. This wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about giving back. Daniel took a deep breath and spoke. "Years ago, I was just another homeless man. People saw me as a failure, someone beyond saving. I believed that too." He glanced at Judge Williams. "But one person gave me a second chance, and that changed everything." The room was silent. People listened, not just to his words, but to his story. "I'm not here because I got lucky," Daniel continued. "I'm here because someone believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." He smiled. "And now, I get to do the same for others." Judge Williams nodded, a small smile on his face. This was more than just a second chance. It was a new beginning, for Daniel, and for everyone who needed to hear his story.